Hello, thank you for taking the time to watch this recorded paper. My name is Adam Henschke. I'm a senior lecturer with the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University, Canberra. And today I'm going to be talking about military ethics and smart cities, new issues for fighting wars well in urban environments. So the basic point that I want to get across is that the combination, this is an important thing, the combination of new technologies like the Internet of Things and urban conflict mean that we have to rethink what ought to be included in military ethics. That's the basic idea. So here's how I'm going to go about convincing you of that. So as an overview, I'm going to start off with the notion of the Internet of Things and urban conflict with a bit of a sort of motivating examples. Then I'm going to introduce what I'm calling the 4 S's of IoT and urban conflict. There's surveillance, services, systems, and security. So I'll come back to these in a bit. So let's have a look at the motivating problem. Let's imagine a smart city that has well-integrated transport infrastructure. So this is a background condition. We've got an urban environment, but it's a highly technologically integrated environment. And a particular feature that I want to look at here is a well-integrated transport infrastructure. So basically what I mean by that is smart cars in communication with each other and with the large driving system. So an important thing to recognise with autonomous vehicles is autonomous vehicles exist in a larger comprehensive driving system. It's not just the vehicles that, and the autonomous features of the vehicles that are important, but those vehicles in combination with other vehicles and in combination with a kind of developed road system and a larger transport infrastructure. So it's not just cars, but this larger driving system. Now let's consider that an adversary finds a security vulnerability in this system and then uses that vulnerability to shut down large amounts of transport. So the urban city, the urban centre is brought to a standstill. Cars are all stopped. People can get out of their cars, but the cars are no longer moving. Importantly, for this example, this is one of the interesting and challenging features of the Internet of Things. In this scenario, no one is necessarily hurt and nothing is damaged. So, let's say the adversary, the attacker, the aggressor, however you want to describe them, they found this vulnerability or set of vulnerabilities in the city's driving system, and not only can they exploit this vulnerability, but they do it in a way so that there's no car crashes, the cars, let's say they all kind of slowly come to a halt and then let people out. It's all super safe, no one is hurt and nothing is damaged. So to get you kind of thinking about this, first question, is this an act of war? Now, we would normally think an attack on an urban centre by an adversary would either be an act of war or a highly, highly organised act of terrorism, but that would be above and beyond the normal level of terrorism. So normally we'd think of something like this as an act of war. However, again, recall that in this situation, no one is hurt and nothing is damaged. War, generally revolves around killing people, breaking stuff, as the old saying goes. So is this an act of war? And some of you, I think our intuition is probably split here. Some of you would say yes, some of you would say no. But then, that's a descriptive question. The ethical question is this a permissible act of aggression? So let's assume that, okay, this is an act of aggression. Yeah, it's a kind of part of a military campaign or something like this. But is this a permissible act of aggression? This is where the ethics comes in. No one is hurt and nothing is damaged. How do we morally assess this sort of engagement? And then the question that then kind of flows from this is, can military ethics deal with a situation like this? I think military ethics can, and that's kind of one of the underpinning points of my paper here. I think military ethics can deal with these sorts of things, but it has to be adapted and supplanted, I guess, a couple of other principles or ideas. Before we get to that, however, I'm going to move to the rise of urban conflict, given the topic of today's or the EuroISME conference. I don't think this really needs much explanation, but basically we are facing a rise of urban conflict. I quite like David Kilcullen's work Out of the Mountains to help describe this. He says, this was written in 2013 from memory, in the future, all aspects of human life, including but not only conflict, crime and violence, will be crowded, urban, network and coastal. Importantly for the points I want to make today, Kilcullen notes the role that increased connectivity will play in future conflict. He says, modern long-range communications and globally networked connectivity and the addition of cyberspace to the traditional land, sea and air domains, the littoral zone, have already undermined the spatial conception of war zones, and they create virtual theatres. He writes, conflict spaces that draw in populations and forces with no geographical connection to the conflict, which may be located anywhere on the planet. That's my emphasis there. But he's really hit on this point that not only are we facing, a changing or increased likelihood of urban conflict, but the nature of that conflict is changing, particularly with long-range communications and technological dependencies and interdependencies. These conflict spaces draw in populations and forces that can act remotely. They have no geographical connection to the conflict, and this can actually allow them to be located anywhere on the planet. So this really kind of sets up a whole host of challenges. Point here that he makes that I want to emphasise quite obviously is that urban conflict is not only increasing, but will be increasingly technical, so relying on, or exploiting, I should say, new technologies. So what are these new technologies? So what I want to talk about here is the Internet of Things and the smart city. The Internet of Things, of IoT, we can understand that as the sets and combinations of technologies in which different components have sensors, can communicate to each other, and can affect change in the physical environment. This is a really important factor that is affecting change in the physical environment. So as distinct from the internet traditional or internet classic, as some of you might call it, the Internet of Things will often involve the capacity to affect change in the physical environment, and this will be done without the direct input or decision making by humans. It's an Internet of Things. Ideally, people are involved as minimally as possible in their decisions and outcomes here. So to spell this out, let's imagine that your smartphone is in communication with your smart home. The GPS in your smartphone registers that you are 20 meters from your home's front door, and so communicates with the smart lock in the door, unlocking it. You approach the door, and you can now enter the house without having to do anything to unlock it. The sensor, the GPS in your phone, the communicators between your phone and the house are linked to the effectors. These are the things that bring about the physical changes in the locking mechanism in the front door, and some decision support mechanisms that make your life simple and easy. So this is a small scale example of the way kind of seamless Internet of Things work. You've got things in communication, so smartphone, smart front door. You've got sensors, so they know where you are, and you've got this capacity to bring about some physical change. The unlocking of the door is a physical change in the environment brought about by the informational technologies. So let's scale this up now to the smart city. Imagine this, but at the level of a city. Here we have vast numbers of passengers working or entertaining themselves in autonomous vehicles driving on smart roads. Smart offices will only allow people with authorization into specified buildings and rooms, will turn lights on or off, and will control the temperature depending on people using the given rooms. Shopping centres will remove the need for cash registers or any transactions at all. So the customer can freely walk around any part of the store, pick up any item that they desire, put them in their bag, with any such decisions being registered as a purchase to the customer's desired bank account. And for those disinclined to leave their home or office for lunch or dinner, they can purchase any and all manner of goods, including food, via a voice-activated assistant, and have takeaway food delivered by drone directly to their door. So this is slightly, a little bit speculative, but all of these technologies exist and are in use or are being developed for use. Drone delivery, we already use, cards to scan into buildings that'll probably shift facial efficient technology. Our phones can be used to unlock and access things, etc. So what we're seeing now is like the smart home example, but at the level of a city. Now, this poses a military risk. The IoT is often referred to as the Internet of Threats due to significant security vulnerabilities. So what the IoT and unsecured IoT does is it puts informational security and physical safety of a smart city's inhabitants at risk. Informational, if the sensors and or communications are insecure, then an adversary can have large sections of the population under surveillance. Then there are also physical implications. An adversary exploits a flaw in the smart city, such as all doors in the smart offices get locked, all lifts are stopped, and all electricity and water are shut off. The adversary has literally put office workers in the city under siege. But again, note, like the example I had earlier with the attack on the smart vehicles and autonomous driving systems, no one is at least immediately physically harmed. No physical damage is done. So we've got this really interesting thing where you can put an entire city under siege remotely. No one is necessarily immediately physically harmed, but you basically, you're engaged in a siege. Now, some of you might be thinking I'm, probably getting a little bit carried away with myself here, but this is a real threat. So the Director General of ASIO, this is Australia's lead intelligence agency, was talking recently about why the intelligence agencies advised the government to ban 5G in Australia. The official said that the real problem was that Beijing could order Huawei or the other major Chinese telecoms gear makers, ZTE, to switch things off, and that disrupts the country. Elements of it, or the whole country. That's why you've got to be concerned, he said. The sewage pump stops working. Clean water doesn't come to you. You can imagine the social implications of that. Or the public transport network doesn't work. Or electric cars that are self-driving don't work. And that has implications for society, implications for the economy. So here's the source for that quote. So again, this isn't me making up these absurd scenarios. They might be absurd, but I'm not the only one thinking about this. So this is a likely threat that we are going to have to face in the future. So what I'm going to say here, and now we're moving to the ethics, given a bit of a descriptive thing, but what I want to suggest here is that smart cities expand what we need to include in military ethics. And I'm going to start here looking at surveillance. So while the just war tradition has generally and justifiably kept the ad bellum and in bello criteria, kept to the ad bellum in bello criteria and post bellum and other such things, we need to include more issues in our military ethics. So one of the issues that I think military ethics in a context of smart cities and conflict needs to take into account is surveillance. The sheer number of sensors in a smart city mean that vast amounts of data can be gathered on a city's population. These sensors are also likely to be more invisible to the sources and targets of surveillance than existing urban surveillance systems like CCTV. The Internet of Things relies on a whole bunch of miniaturized sensors, and so it will be visible, we'll be completely unaware of it, and the fact that we are under surveillance. And importantly, it's not just that smart cities will be packed with surveillance devices, but that these devices will be remotely accessible. This was Gil Cullen's point, and also the ASIO Director General's point. So this means that those who either already have access to the sensors, know the passwords to gain illegitimate access to sensors and data, and or have the power to hack those communications networks, can observe the city, its individuals, and the population remotely. So what does this mean for military ethics? So the first military ethics question is, how do we respond if and when such surveillance is disclosed? Second, should liberal democracies which promote privacy and see it as a fundamental value of liberal democracies, should they engage in such surveillance on adversaries' smart cities themselves? And third, what is a domestic government's responsibility for ensuring that an IoT-enabled smart city is in fact secure? I'm not going to offer any answers to this at the moment. My point is more that we need to think about these issues and think about them in the context of military ethics, something that surveillance generally hasn't been covered in at least traditional military ethics before. The next theme or problem is to do with services. So the smart city means that services can be disrupted. So the IoT offers egressors an option for physical impacts that are not necessarily fatal nor physically destructive, as I mentioned before. This, I suggest, that attacks on systems can be considered a form of PSYOP. So PSYOP, psychological operations conducted by states to achieve political ends, such as the use of propaganda against an enemy, together with such other operational measures of a military, economic, or political nature as may be required to supplement propaganda. So if an adversary can shut down, a driving system, can shut down a set of offices, can shut down a smart city, this has huge propaganda effect. It has a huge capacity to affect people, and particularly undermine people's trust and certainty in the fact that their government is able to provide minimum services. Now, again, the issue here is that things like PSYOP are not typically considered in military ethics. So non-destructive attacks that impact the government's capacity to deliver services. The point here is not to state whether such non-destructive service-targeted attacks meet the just war criteria. Rather, I want to point out that with the rise of IoT-supported smart cities, militaries need to think about their ethics of targeting services. And these questions span both jus ad bellum and jus in bello. So we can ask, would service attacks that have physical impacts but are not immediately life-threatening count as a just cause, or would they fit with the efforts to adhere to the last resort criteria? If service attacks are chosen, how should warfighters weigh up the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure against the recognition that such attacks are potentially far less physically damaging and less lethal than a traditional kinetic attack? So the point here is that once we start recognising that there's service level attacks, this puts pressure on how we understand principles like just cause and last resort in the ad bellum aspects. In the in bello aspects, it makes us really have to think about, do we go for discrimination? Do we preference discrimination over proportionality? So again, I'm not offering any answers here, but showing how we need to rethink military ethics in light of the services that IoT attacks can undermine. The next issue is the notion of systems. Basically, a smart city is a system of systems. A smart city, holistically considered, is not a single thing, but a set of dynamic, evolving, complex, interlinked, interdependent systems. There will be a lot of unpredictable effects simply arising from the combination of systems. This complexity and interdependence of systems means increased vulnerability to attack. The basic problem here is one of unpredictability, how this can lead to either overestimates of success or underestimates of the impacts. What does this mean for military ethics? So here we've got, it makes us rethink probability of success and proportionality. The issue that I want to draw out here is the role of cognitive biases in affecting how we judge probability of success and proportionality. So this is a quote from Ned Dovos. He says, "If I judge a particular plan or policy endeavour to be morally right or admirable, I am more likely to believe it will work than if I had the opposite moral appraisal of the plan. If a war maker believes that his cause is just, as almost all war makers do, this is liable to inflate his expectation of success." So the point here comes back to the notion of, if the Internet of Things can shut down a system without necessarily immediately killing people, harming people, or destroying property, it is possible that decision makers will be more inclined to see that as successful. It will inflate the expectation of success. So when trying to make the proportionality calculations also across multiple systems, each of which is unpredictable, it makes such calculations harder and potentially more susceptible to the sorts of cognitive biases that Dovos is concerned about. So the point here is we need to have a principle like recognition that we're dealing with systems that can frame the decisions in reference to systems of systems and unpredictability. So again, it's not that we have to get rid of something like probability of success or the proportionality calculations, but we need to recognise that the way that these systems can impact how we conduct those assessments, make those judgments. This is the last of the criteria here, security. Many of the IoT services and infrastructure will be provided by foreign powers and may potentially allow foreign agents access to and control over these systems. This aspect is a combination, so this security aspect is a combination of the three previous points. that needs to be viewed in addition to them. Basically, we have issues of logistics and supply chain security, which is exactly the point made by the ASIO Director General. So what does this security issue mean for military ethics? Military ethics needs to consider things like broader national security concerns as part of a wider net of interests. When considering smart cities, those who are involved in military decision-making need to think of the ethical concerns about using the vulnerabilities of an adversary's civilian infrastructure. And this could, in fact, go to some people, Ned Dobos, for instance, and a few others have been pushing or suggesting an idea that we ought to consider US antebellum. So is it morally justified for a state to deliberately supply another population with IoT infrastructure that could be purposed for military or strategic ends? We also need to ensure that non-military sectors think of military ethics. Just war principles will need to be adapted, updated, and amended, etc., as I've been suggesting, to be part of a discussion about national security ethics. And so here there is an increased need for those in the civilian sector that develop and oversee the IoT to not only recognise the national security implications of these new technologies, but to consider the ethical considerations as central to the design of the IoT. So what are the implications for military ethics? Final slide here. The 4 S's that I've described above are not intended to supplant or replace military ethics principles. However, in order to actually make those principles applicable and useful, they need to be adapted to the new IoT-enabled smart city environments and context. And if considering offensive or defensive military actions involving smart cities, principles of surveillance and safety need to be considered alongside traditional just war criteria. Services and security, however, can potentially be captured by criteria like last resort, probability of success, proportionality. But surveillances and services and security, can be used to first help recognise there are military ethics concerns beyond the traditional just war scope. And second, services and security can guide the adaptation of relatively general principles to the IoT-enabled environments and contexts. So thanks for listening. I hope that made sense, and hopefully we'll all see each other in the flesh at the next EuroISME. Thank you.